Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Samuel Ortiz, and I'm going to be speaking on the topic of IQ tests and cognitive ability tests today. I hope to give you a little brief history about it, and I want to put it together in a way that makes it accessible rather than non-technical. This presentation was sponsored by Dr. Julia Esparza Brown from Portland State University, and it is designed primarily to help you understand the difference between the old terminology of IQ test and the new terminology that we call cognitive ability tests. There are a lot of preconceptions about what an IQ test is, and I hope that I might be able to dispel them for you here. So let's move on. Back in the 1850s, well, actually about 1860, this guy, whom you probably know, gentleman by the name of Charles Darwin, published his volume on the origin of the species and really kind of revolutionized science in general. Now, he was not a psychologist, he was a naturalist, obviously, but he had a lot of influence on what was going to happen in psychology. And part of the influence that came about was that he actually was related to somebody you might know, and his name was Francis Galton. Both of these gentlemen were knighted, so they're both Sir Charles Darwin and Sir Francis Galton, and they were in fact cousins. Now, because they're cousins, that might lead you to believe that there was a bit of sibling rivalry that might have been occurring between them, and you're right about that. It's very likely that Francis Galton, who was really no, withering vine here by himself, he was a very intelligent kind of guy. He set out more to look at intelligence and apply maybe some of Darwin's ideas to human beings. All right. Remember, Darwin was really observing animals at the time, and nobody was really thinking too much about it in terms of, well, how might this apply to human beings? And Galton was one of the first to kind of do that. Don't know if he was trying to steal Darwin's thunder, but he probably didn't. Nevertheless, Galton began his career by really trying to see if we could quantify everything, including intelligence. And he thought that might be done by measuring people. Yes, literally by measuring people's heads, brains, other parts of their body, their visual acuity, all kinds of things, reaction time, decision speed. It didn't really matter. Galton was heavily influenced by other Europeans at the time who had come to believe, albeit mistakenly, that intelligence could be determined by measuring various physical characteristics in people. The idea was that people carried a physical expression of a genetically based inherited trait. Well, as you can kind of see from these pictures, that didn't work out so well, did it? But some small remnants of his ideas still remain even in tests today, mostly those administered by neuropsychologists, such as grip strength, reaction time, sensory motor functioning, etc. All right. Finally, by the turn of the new millennium, that is the 1900s, all right, a test was born. It was born in France, okay, and the fathers of that test were Alfred Binet on the left and Theodore Simon on the right. Naturally, they called their test the Binet-Simon scale. So, good. That makes a whole lot of sense, right? And it was perhaps the structure that is followed by modern day tests. It wasn't a modern test per se, but it certainly was an important test that influenced everything else that was to come. And poor Theodore Simon was kind of hoping that maybe people wouldn't forget his name because, hey, it carried his name there, right? That's the Binet-Simon scale. Yeah, well, unfortunately, only Binet's name kind of continues today. There is the Stanford Binet in its 5th edition that is still currently available. And I'm sure Simon is sort of spinning in his grave wondering, but what about me? Well, Alfred Binet was a really, really kind of smart guy, okay? And he knew that his test really wasn't a test of intelligence. He knew it was a test primarily intended to measure the academic achievement, that is, what students had learned in school. In fact, his test was made up of all kinds of academic tests that were leveled to each age and grade. So basically a collection of tests from, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade on up. And he would give them to you. If you could do the fourth grade tasks, well, then you were at least at a fourth grade level, which corresponded roughly to an age of about 9. If you could do the fifth grade tasks, that meant you had a mental age of about, 10 or so. So basically, that's how he saw it. He didn't really ever see his test as being something that was an intelligence test. He did flirt with the idea for a while because people were telling him, I think it's an intelligence test, Dr. Binet. But he was like, yeah, maybe, but no, that it's not, okay? It's not an intelligence test, and he should know because he's the one that developed it. Well, long about that same time that he put this test out there was a guy by the name of Henry Herbert Goddard. Henry Herbert Goddard was an American who had been appointed as research director of a place called the Vineland Institute for Feeble-Minded Boys and Girls. Yes, that's the exact name. And where was it located? In a little town called Vineland, New Jersey. And when he became the research director, he didn't know anything about intelligence testing. He didn't know anything about how people were classified according to different criteria. He didn't know anything about how, the problems of individuals with mental difficulties might impact society. Didn't know anything about that. But he thought, well, I better go learn. Now, I've got to give him some credit. He flew off to Europe. Well, he took a boat off to Europe, no doubt. And he started studying with a guy by the name of Charles Spearman, who we'll learn about a little bit more, who was a mathematician teaching everybody factor analytic techniques, factor analysis, that he had invented, okay, although Sir Francis Galton tried to claim that he had invented it, but no, it was actually Charles Spearman. And he was teaching it to everybody. And it was sort of an important tool to know back then. Now, Goddard, while over there in England, because it's so close to France, just separated, by the English Channel there, he was introduced to the Binet-Simon scales, and he loved them. And he brought them back with him from England and or France, actually, to the United States, and he translated them into English, and he declared his test, the translated Binet scales, all right, at least he kept the name Binet, right? But he declared it an intelligence test. Not because it followed some kind of theory, not because Binet said it was an intelligence test, but merely because he believed that's what it is. He declared it to be so. And this was really the beginning of a very big problem. What kind of problems? Well, initially the numbers didn't make any sense when it came to testing. So let me give you an example. All right. Let's say you're 10 years old and that's your chronological age, okay? Then you take the test, but you test at only an 8-year-old level. So you can't do anything more than what an 8-year-old could do on Binet's scale. Okay, that's called your mental age. So now Binet had said what you do is you subtract, okay, your chronological age from your mental age. So if you were 8 years mental age and your chronological age was 10, as I've shown here, then you were a -2, which sounds pretty ominous, doesn't it? But what the heck is a -2 anyway? Well, nobody really knew. Not that Binet actually cared all that much. Binet's intention wasn't to just generate a number. His intent was to figure out how far below your actual chronological age were you. Big differences, maybe -2 is a big difference, certainly getting there, maybe 3, maybe 4, probably 5, absolutely, would indicate that you were low enough to merit some type of intervention. You see, Binet had been commissioned by, the Ministry of Education while he was in France to identify the lowest performing students so that something could be done to help them. Binet had not been sort of independently developing an intelligence test. He had, in fact, developed an achievement test, which was supposed to be used to identify those who really weren't performing up to their age and grade level. And that's what his test did. So for him, a larger difference meant you have a greater need for intervention and instruction or remedial instruction. That's it. The test was never meant to be an intelligence test, and he tried forcefully to explain that to people. But as I said, people like Goddard and then Lewis Terman, I'll speak about him a little bit later on as well, translated the test into English and pretty much said it is a test of intelligence and we're going to treat it that way. Of course, when you've got numbers like -2, nobody knows what you're talking about, right? So the new math came to the rescue. In what way? Well, there's this guy, his name is William Stern, and he's a German mathematician and psychologist and philosopher. And he says, okay, look, it's very simple, you see. All you got to do is, instead of subtracting the mental age from the chronological age, you should divide. All right, divide the mental age by the chronological age. All right, so here we have another example. If you're 10 years old, once again, your chronological age, and you test at a 10-year-old level, that's your mental age, what do? Well, you divide 10 by 10, and what do you get? You get 1, which is so much better than -2, isn't it? But what the heck is a 1? Well, everybody again was kind of wondering, yeah, you got a nice idea there, Billy, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what are you going to do? Well, along comes the guy I told you before, Louis Terman, who was a professor at Stanford University in California. And in 1917, he took the Binet scales, translated them into English himself, and standardized it on a group of kids out there in California. And he said, hey, I don't like that 1 either, but I know what we can do with it. And Terman said, multiply it by 100. And that's what they did. So basically, a 1 times 100 is 100. And that became the first ratio IQ. You get it, right? Because see, it's called an intelligence quotient. IQ is not a word by itself. I don't even believe it's accepted in Scrabble, is it? It's called an intelligence quotient, IQ, because we are dividing things here. It's called math, people, and that's where the term comes from. But once a term like this gets out into the popular culture, it's almost impossible. In fact, it's probably impossible to claw it back. It's not going to change. We're going to have to live with it. We're going to have to use it. We're going to have to try to understand it. And unfortunately, despite all of the developments over the years, despite all the admonitions about what it is and what it isn't, everybody thinks they know what IQ is. Seriously, ask yourself, what do you think it is? And I'm sure that the answer is going to be, well, it's an indication of how smart you are. And not exactly. But we're going to talk more about what it truly is and what it isn't, and why, in fact, it's no longer even a useful term. All right. Now, while we got that 100, we're in good shape, but it didn't solve all of the problems with the numbers, did it? Yep, there were still some coming up. What do I mean? Well, think about this. It wasn't long after Terman was running around giving his test to everybody, and Goddard was running around giving his test to everybody, that they realized something was amiss. Okay, let's say you were just an average person. Okay, your IQ was 100 because at age 10, you tested 10 by mental age, which is a 1 times 100 gives you a 100. And basically 100 was thought to be the average score. All right, at this time, they didn't really know if that was truly average, but it was close enough, okay? Because that's where you were no more intelligent than you were supposed to be and no less intelligent than you were supposed to be. But the problem was this. By the time you turned 20 years of age, that meant you needed to test at 20 years mental age in order to keep being dead on average of 100, right? Because 20 divided by 20 is 1 times 100 would be 100. The only problem was the test stopped at about mental age 16. Now, you could extend it upwards. You could add some more if you wanted to. Nobody had quite done that just yet. They were thinking about doing this because of this very problem. So what it meant was early on when people were trying to adopt this IQ, you could run into a whole bunch of difficulties by doing nothing at all. So, for example, if you test at mental age 16, because that's as far as the test goes, but you happen to be 20, like I'm showing you in this example, you just turned 20, your IQ is now dropped. How so? Well, 16 divided by 20 is 0.8 times 100 is 80. So you've gone from an IQ of 100 when you were 10 years old, pretty much average, to being an 80, which was, wow, getting down there at the lower end of the average range. Some people would have said it's already in the borderline range. Some people might have said it was actually already in the below average range. So you lost IQ points simply because you grew older. It's not the way that it's supposed to work. You can't just, go home and start crying in your sleep because you're getting dumber as you get older. So you see, things weren't working out very well early on for these tests, at least as far as numbers go. But the term IQ was sticking big time because everybody was associating it with how intelligent you happened to be, regardless of the fact that the numbers really weren't coming out the way that they were supposed to come out, and they weren't describing what people were supposed to be actually possessing in terms of general intelligence. So, what happened? Well, the modern IQ test really wasn't born until about 1939. And the father of the modern IQ test, most people probably would agree, was a gentleman by the name of David Wechsler. Now, who was David Wechsler? Well, he was a psychologist, okay? He had a practice in Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. Yes, that same Bellevue Hospital. And he had been a young resident there in the early 1917, and he was fortunate enough during World War I to enlist. Well, he didn't enlist. He became an officer, so he was commissioned into the Army as a very young lieutenant, and he got to work on the committee on the psychological examination of Army recruits. It was a committee started by a guy named Robert Yerkes, who was the psychologist and president of the American Psychological Association. And their task was to figure out how they could separate men into enlisted men, that is, infantrymen, those who just take the orders, and carry them out, versus officers who would give the orders, okay, and watch the infantrymen carrying them out. So Wechsler met a lot of psychologists at that time, including Lewis Terman, including people like Henry Herbert Goddard, although I'm not sure Goddard was on that particular committee, but several more of the preeminent psychologists of the day and people working on testing during the day were involved. And so Wechsler had a front row seat in terms of what was going on. The war ended in a short 8 months for the United States. 4-year war, but the U.S. was only in it for 8 months. By 1918, he's heading back to his practice in Manhattan at Bellevue Hospital. And he realizes that, a small problem. How do you know somebody is lacking in intelligence versus somebody who's just psychotic? And he figured, I need to know this. This would be an important thing for him to know, right? In differential diagnosis. So he said, I'm going to create my own test, and he did. In 1939, he developed what he called the Wechsler-Bellevue scales. And this was a test for adults to begin with, okay, because, well, I'll let you in on the secret. He didn't create it out of thin air. He borrowed it heavily from the test he had been exposed to. And what was the test he was exposed to? Well, it was the test while he was in the Army called the Army Mental Test that had been developed by everybody there. Now, things back then were looked at very medically. They weren't looked at very proprietary. Like Binet didn't mind that Terman and Goddard had translated his test into English. He didn't sue him for copyright infringement. So when Wechsler borrowed the Army mental test to create his Wechsler-Bellevue, nobody got upset about that. He's using it in a medical setting, so why not use the best available medical tools, right? So it made a lot of sense. But Wechsler was well aware of that problem with the numbers, and he wasn't about to just rely on that. So he brought in some more sophisticated psychometrics that he had learned about, and he adopted what is known as the normal probability curve to describe performance. When you hear about normative samples or norm samples, when you hear about normative expectations, when you hear about the normal curve, all right, when you hear about grading on a curve, all of that is based on this, what's called the normal probability curve, which somehow just seems to occur in general nature. We didn't create this, we just kind of observed it. So what you see is that if you take virtually any trait, any human trait, you can measure people, measure people, measure people. And if you measure enough people, a lot of them, you end up with a curve like this, where approximately 68% of the population scores between one standard deviation above the mean and one standard deviation below the mean. So if you were to put that in numbers, as you see on this chart, if we say 100 is average and a standard deviation is 15, then that means that 68% of the population would have, in this case, an IQ score of between 85 and 115. 70%, almost 7 out of 10 people. 14% would have an IQ score between 1 to 2 standard deviations below the mean, as well as between 1 to 2 standard deviations above the mean. Okay? And then 2% would have an IQ score, let's say, between 2 to 3 standard deviations below the mean, or between 2 to 3 standard deviations above the mean. And if you add all of that up, right there, you're already at 99% almost. 98 if you're not rounding, 99 if you do round up, which means there's not much left over in that curve to go above or below that, is there? All right, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later because this is an important part of it. But it was David Wechsler that introduced then what we call the deviation IQ to his test. And that's what this means. There were no more any ratio IQ scores being used. They were all, from this point on, basically deviation IQ scores. But DIQ sounds pretty terrible, doesn't it? Nobody wants to say that. And IQ had already entrenched itself in popular culture, so it wasn't about to get out. It was going to stay in there. And of note, Wechsler borrowed the Army mental test, which had not been based on any type of theory. So that meant that his test of intelligence, as he believed, was measuring intelligence in an atheoretical way. Now, he was good enough of a scientist to recognize that's not a good thing to do. So what did he decide to do? He said, all right, let me think about intelligence out there, and what am I going to do? Well, I'm just going to say it's general intelligence because that's the easiest thing to do. And that's what he did. And not only did he do that, but everybody that followed did that. Lewis Terman's test, which had preceded the Wechsler-Bellevue scales, was a measure of general intelligence. Goddard's scales were a measure of general intelligence because they were all, just like Wechsler, following in Spearman's footsteps. Now, it's important to understand what's going on here. And I'm going to give you an example of the evolution of IQ tests and how they really are very different than what we've had before, by showing you the Wechsler scales and their own kind of evolution over the past, I guess it would now be almost 100 years, but not quite. All right, so 1939 Wechsler-Bellevue, right? 10 years later, Wechsler, having found some pretty decent success with his Wechsler-Bellevue, says, I need to create a test for children. And so he says, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and he releases it in 1949. He had actually changed the name after the Wechsler-Bellevue to the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales by 1944. All right, and so 1949, it kind of made sense to create the children's version, and this is what he came up with. Now, the WISC, as it's known, as well as the WAIS, the Adult Intelligence Scale, had the very same theoretical structure that he was sticking to, which he had borrowed from Charles Spearman, the same guy who had taught factor analysis to everybody in Europe as well as the United States and helping them figure out what it's all about. Yes, Charles Mr. G. Spearman. So when you hear the term general intelligence, or you hear just somebody talk about G and it's italicized little g, that is a representation or an indication that they're referring to general intelligence. So for Wechsler, his full scale IQ, because he used the IQ term, and the FS was just his way of saying there's a full scale IQ, because as you're going to see, there are lesser IQs too. But the full scale IQ was a representation of general ability. But his test, having been borrowed from the Army mental test, was comprised of two things. One was the verbal portion, which he termed the verbal IQ or VIQ, and the other part was the performance version or performance IQ, which he called the PIQ. And once again, these were not things that Wechsler himself had just kind of, made up out of thin air. Okay. In reality, the verbal IQ had come from the Army mental test alpha version, which required literacy. It was heavily influenced by things like vocabulary, comprehension, information, verbal similarities, language, and knowledge, and so on and so forth. Okay. The performance IQ had come from the Army mental test called beta, the beta version, which required minimal literacy. Even though the instructions were given with some language, they were more performance-oriented tasks. That is, you didn't respond verbally, you just did things. All right. So mostly visual processing, speed of processing, or nonverbal kinds of reasonings. So once again, I'm going to give you the meaning of these acronyms. Little g is general intelligence, Spearman's G. FSIQ stands for full scale IQ, VIQ and PIQ, performance and verbal IQ. But note that none of these IQs, other than the general IQ, were real things. They were just the structure of the test. But by applying IQ to them, they took on a life of their own, and they gave further energy to the concept of IQ. At this time, general ability or general intelligence was measured by a total of 12 subtests that Wechsler had created, borrowed. He did create some new ones, but he borrowed heavily from the Army mental testing program. Now, what were they? Well, let's take a look. This is 1949. Okay, and watch what happens here. 25 years later, they finally revised the test. So in 1974, the WISC-R, WISC revised version, comes out. So it took 2.5 decades before that happened, something which is very important. I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And how did it change things? Well, it didn't change things at all. The verbal IQ remained. He still called it the verbal IQ. It was made up of 6 subtests: information, similarities, digit span, arithmetic, comprehension, vocabulary. It's not important that you know what these subtests are measuring, just that this is what they were. The performance items in the performance IQ also remained the same: 6 subtests: picture completion, picture arrangement, block design, object assembly, coding, and mazes. Okay, very, very simple. So that meant that the structure of intelligence, even after 25 years had gone by, didn't change. Little g, Spearman's G, was there, and how was it calculated? On the basis of all 12 subtests. Nothing had changed, but by 1974, there were significant changes already occurring in our understanding of general intelligence and general ability. The problem? None of the people doing the research on human cognitive abilities and advancing it forward had created an intelligence test. And because of that, the tests were always behind what the theory was telling us. And so, because IQ was really paramount here, full-scale IQ in particular, it didn't really change a whole lot in terms of what was happening. How much so? Well, check this out. Another 17 years go by before the Wechsler scales are revised again, this time in 1991. So the WISC-3 comes out, but it begins finally to show a little bit of an evolution in terms of what's going on. Not a lot, but a little bit. What do I mean by that? Well, the old verbal IQ actually kind of goes away. It was never a real thing to begin with, so dropping it was probably a good thing. And they changed the name to the Verbal Comprehension Index. Much better way of identifying what was being measured. This also began to coincide a little bit with these theories I was telling you about that are already happening in the background with researchers that are doing them, so that VCI was also comparable to what we call GC, which is comprehension and knowledge. I've got the acronyms listed for you a little bit later on, so don't worry about what they mean. I'll show you. The VCI was then comprised of information, similarities, that's verbal similarities, vocabulary, and comprehension. It also included then a new index called the Perceptual Organization Index. So rather than calling it the PIQ, it's gone. Now it's the Perceptual Organization Index, or pretty much a measure of visual processing with a little bit maybe of fluid reasoning thrown in, but not so much. And what was it comprised of? Picture completion, object assembly, block design, and picture arrangement. And then there was a little bit of processing speed. So the processing speed index was developed, and it was made up of coding and symbol search subtests. And then, because remember, Wechsler had 12 subtests going on back then, there were a few left over. Well, a couple. Arithmetic and digit span. And because they didn't really go together and they didn't make a composite or an index or anything on their own, they just kind of got combined haphazardly. And that's why this particular index is in gray here rather than black, because it was called FFD or FD, freedom from distractibility. That's it. That's the only way they could figure out how to relate these two. But arithmetic measures math knowledge, and digit span measures working memory. They don't really go together. And so the measurement of intelligence kind of also began to alter. Now, instead of having 12 subtests comprising general intelligence, it was only 10. The 8 on the left for the VCI and the Perceptual Organization Index, the POI, and 1 from PSI and 1 that still included arithmetic. But digit span and symbol search were no longer a part of that. So here you have the acronyms on the right in case you want to know what they are. All right. That was 1991. That's not ancient history, is it? But that's still, wow, we're talking 33 years ago, so it's a little bit dated. But then what happens? Another 12 years go by, and in 2003, the WISC-4 comes out. So now we're only talking 21 years ago. So what did the WISC-4 look like? Well, they cut the VCI down to just similarities, vocabulary, and comprehension. The Perceptual Organizational Index kind of got refined a little bit, and they have picture concepts, block design, and matrix reasoning, trying to bring back a little bit of that fluid ability there. Processing speed is still there, symbol search and coding, and working memory now is a new one. Gone is that freedom from distractibility because it was a junk factor. It didn't measure something real. It was an amalgamation of things that didn't go together. They were just left over. And now these 10 subtests are the ones that combine to create the full-scale IQ. So full-scale IQ is still there, but it's referencing only one score when in fact there are now 4 additional scores that are provided in addition to the 10 subtests themselves, but we don't interpret at the subtest level. So therefore, we really just look at the indexes or full-scale IQ. So what's this now? Well, this is another change where the tests, and the Wechsler is no different than any other ones, were beginning to adhere more strongly to a theoretical framework. And what framework was that? Well, I'm going to show you. It's basically called CHC theory, which stands for Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of human cognitive abilities. And we'll get to that because, believe it or not, the WISC-4, all right, is still 21 years old. And what happens? Not 12 years later, but 11 years later, they then publish the WISC-5. And this is the most current one. And if you're wondering, well, gee, that was 10 years ago, aren't they coming out with the WISC-6? I would bet that they are. I am absolutely certain that it is probably under development, and I don't know when it might come out, but I would say, given the amount of time that has elapsed, I wouldn't give it more than a couple more years because of the way things have gone. And what you've seen is that now tests are being revised and updated about every 10 years or so. It used to be on average more of about 20. So why the hurry now? Well, it's a little bit easier to do it now than before because a lot of things are going digital. We have scores that are available online, and so we can collect what are called continuous norms. That just makes it a whole lot easier. It's not the only reason, but it's certainly one of them. Anyway, what's the structure now? Well, the VCI has been cut back further. It's only made up of similarities in vocabulary. The working memory is made up of digit span and picture span. The processing speed is still coding and symbol search. And then the perceptual reasoning index got split. Into what? Into VSI, which is the visual spatial index, measuring visual processing by visual puzzle and block design, and the fluid reasoning index, which is figure weights, a new subtest, and matrix reasoning. And so what has happened now, as you can see here, is that the full-scale IQ is comprised of only 7 subtests. Isn't that interesting that we've gone from 12 to 7 subtests? That we're norming tests even faster than before, and that we're measuring more and more things. The WISC-5 now gives you at least 5 indexes, and it can measure another index called long-term storage and retrieval with what's called the storage and retrieval index as well. So it can measure 6 different areas of functioning. It never used to be able to do that. Remember, the first 2, the WISC and the WISC-R, simply gave you a full-scale IQ, and the rest of it was not really that important. But that's no longer the case. Things are changing dramatically. And because they're changing dramatically, we have to kind of keep up with the times and understand that the term IQ doesn't mean the same as what we used to think it means. And in fact, it might not even be a useful term at all. So what's really changing? Well, all right. I will admit, and you probably will see, that there are remnants of old ideas that still continue to be in the tests that we see today. If we go back to Charles Mr. G. Spearman and his single, factor general intelligence kind of theory, okay, that might have been good for where we started, but it doesn't really help us a lot these days. It's too general. It's kind of like saying, all right, if I have a high general ability, then I'm good. Yeah, I'm good, but what am I good at? Can you tell me specifically what I'm good at? Not really, because it's not designed to do that. It's kind of like GPA. If you have a high GPA, I know you're doing good in reading, writing, and math, but I don't know that you're like really, really astounding in reading and writing, but you're not so hot in math. I can't tell that from the GPA, can I? Same kind of idea. In fact, that was something that this guy, Louis L. Thurstone, LL Thurstone, recognized in the early 1920s. And he was saying, sorry, people, but Spearman's G, that's just an artifact of the way that we construct these tests. They all have positive correlations, and all we're measuring when we call it G is not really general intelligence. It's not even a real thing. That's just the fact that these tests can't correlate negatively. They never do. They're all positive. You can't even get a negative score on the test. So it didn't make sense to him. And he said there are many more than just general intelligence. He called them primary mental abilities. And in fact, he laid down the structure for what we know today as modern theory. It was his beginning. And who kind of followed in his footsteps? There was a gentleman by the name of Raymond Cattell. Ray Cattell was the first to develop a theory called GFGC because he, kind of like Thurstone, was able to use Spearman's factor analysis and say, when I do factor analysis, yeah, I can get a general factor model, but then I can rotate away and get no G and get 2 factors. GF for fluid reasoning and GC for comprehension and knowledge, although Cattell called it crystallized intelligence. And after a while, one of Ray Cattell's students by the name of John Horn, whom I knew well, he has passed away, but he was a mentor of mine, and he took Cattell's data, and for his own dissertation, John Horn reanalyzed it and said, sorry, mentor, but I think you're wrong. I think there's more. I think there's at least 4 kind of abilities we can identify, and maybe even more. And his work provided the advent of modern GFGC theory. And modern is important because Horn worked on these theories all the way into the 80s and 90s. And yet, few of you have probably even ever heard of them. In 1993, there was another gentleman by the name of John Carroll, who was a linguist turned psychologist, and he said, I'm going to look at this research out there on intelligence and intelligence tests and all that. And he gathered over 1,000 data sets, cut it down to about 492 or 93 really good data sets. And he said, let's find out which theory is best supported. Guess which theory was best supported? In fact, which theory was the only one that was supported? Modern GFGC theory. And so he developed his own sort of parallel theory, very similar to modern GFGC theory, except that he was kind of a G-man, and he must have had some affection for Spearman. He said, in my model, there is a general ability, so I'm going to keep it. Okay, Horn and Cattell had really come to the conclusion, you don't really need G. It doesn't really exist anyway, so why bother? But Carroll said, no, I kind of like it, so I'm keeping it in my 3-stratum model. All right. And then In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a couple of guys by the name of Kevin McGrew and Joel Schneider, all right, good friends of mine, very bright guys, said, we need to put this together. And so they took the elements of Cattell's model, elements of Horn's model, elements of Carroll's model, and you see the acronym there, CHC, Cattell, Horn, Carroll, right? And I'm sorry, it looks like I forgot a dash between Horn and Carroll there, because it should be that way. And they said, let's continue to evaluate based on the tests we're giving, and guess what? You guys, there are more than 9 abilities, there are more than 10 abilities. We found a whole bunch of them. And so we need to be paying attention to more abilities than we've been paying attention to in the past. And what did they really do that was incredible? Well, by advancing CHC theory and by doing these meta-factor analytic kinds of studies, joint confirmatory factor analysis, so to speak, they were able to create something akin to a periodic table of the elements for psychology, okay? CHC theory has done for psychology and the measurement of cognitive abilities something that nothing was ever able to do before, and certainly nothing that could have occurred with just the term IQ, which is again why it is outdated. All right, only the evolution of cognitive ability tests in line with CHC theory have brought about this kind of revolution. Gone are the days of IQ tests, okay, where each battery's publisher or author could decide arbitrarily what they wanted to measure and what they would call it. Think about that. I mean, what if somebody, was trying to work with gold and with oxygen or something? And what you call oxygen, I call nitrogen. And what you call gold, I call silver. We're not going to get the same results, all right? We needed a common nomenclature, and CHC theory brought it about. IQ tests, and especially the older ones, were never predicated much on theory, let alone bound by any particular theory. And the result was mayhem and confusion. It's really no wonder that IQ tests didn't go very far in helping us today when we're trying to understand why individuals have difficulties learning things, because it was just way too general. So what does it look like today? Okay, this might look a little overwhelming, and don't worry about all of the nomenclature here and the abbreviations and whatnot. The blue ovals simply represent what we call broad abilities, and the pink and the white squares represent what we call narrow abilities. A broad ability like GF, fluid reasoning, is made up of narrow abilities, which would include the ability to use induction. That's what the I is for. The RG would be general sequential reasoning. The RQ would be quantitative reasoning. All right. So don't worry about all this, but just see that basically we are now able to not only posit and theorize the presence of certain abilities, we can do factor analysis to understand whether they exist. All right. CHC theory is the prevailing framework for understanding human cognitive abilities, all right, to date. No other theory of intelligence, not even General G, comes close to having as much empirical support as CHC theory. It's been so successful that all major tests of intelligence and cognitive ability now have realigned their theoretical structures, because remember, they didn't have one before, but they do now, to be consistent with and interpretable through CHC theory. So current theory has about 16 broad abilities, about 80 narrow abilities, and of those, okay, there are 9 cardinal broad abilities and about 35 narrow abilities that can be measured with current tests. I mean, think about that. 9 broad abilities, whereas before we were only measuring IQ. One single solitary thing, which is an amalgamation of everything that could be measured, and that was it, which really didn't tell us a whole lot, did it? And it did not tell us a whole lot. All right. Yeah, these guys are pretty smart, aren't they? They all know what's going on there. And we must understand that this evolution in theory has now filtered itself down to the way that tests are constructed and published. Gone are these old ideas of what IQ ought to be. Doesn't mean it's out of the popular culture, though, does it? As I said, if I ask you what IQ is, you probably have an idea. Okay, remember that normal probability curve that I showed you before? I mean, you can Google this yourself and say, hey, what was Einstein's IQ? Okay, well, how do we know? Because one, I don't think Einstein ever actually took an IQ test. Okay. Plus, modern day tests measure things differently than before. So even if he took an old one, he might not have the same IQ as before. That doesn't mean he wasn't a smart guy. Of course he was a smart guy. But look at this curve here. What does it mean? You see these numbers at the bottom right above where it says IQ? Well, if you go down 3 standard deviations, well, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4 standard deviations, you're now down to a 40. Tests today cannot measure, and tests even in the past couldn't even measure this well, but you can't get an IQ score of less than 40. Conversely, you can't get an IQ higher than 160. And so how do we know what Einstein's IQ was? I don't know. Unless he took a test, we're never going to know, right? No doubt it was probably high. I am sure that it was there, okay? But we don't really know, all right? And if you score 2 standard deviations above the mean, which would be at the level of 130, guess what? That's enough to call you superior. That's the level at which we could call somebody even a genius. Although some people say, well, it's got to be 4 standard deviations above, so that's where you're a genius. What does genius mean? It just simply means that somehow your ability to perform on these tests is probably better than 99.999% of the people that take the test. You might be 1 in 10,000. But again, what are the tests measuring? I'm going to show you a little bit later that what you think they're measuring is not just this concept of general ability, but it's actually more than that. Plus, the differences in the numbers are very different than what we think. The difference between a 130 IQ and a 160 IQ, which is 30 points, is maybe getting 1 or 2 extra questions correct. That's it. But what's the difference between, say, a 60 IQ and a 90 IQ? Well, that's the difference between being moderately intellectually disabled, that's the term we use instead of mental retardation these days, all right, and being average. So it's not really what your score is, it's more kind of where you fall on that curve that would dictate how much you really know and how much you don't know. So our ideas, popular ideas of IQ, have got to go, okay? When was the last time you were online and you saw this? Oh, can you solve this viral quote-unquote IQ test? Let me tell you now, it's not an IQ test, okay? Or how about this one? Only people with high IQ can clear the blue dots. Gee, but people with high IQs can't spell the word can with only one N, can they? That's not an IQ test either. How about this one? Solving the Sudoku means your IQ is 180. Really? Never mind that we can't measure it to be 180. How would you know that this is 180? And why am I wasting 2 hours giving you a real IQ test when I could just give you this in 10 minutes and find out whether you have a 180? That's not an IQ test, all right? How about this one? I don't know where this number comes from, but look, get your score and your official badge. You have an IQ of over 9,000. That doesn't even merit any further explanation. How about this one? Ooh, Indy 100, the world's shortest IQ test, will reveal your intelligence in just 3 questions. I can reveal your intelligence in 3 questions, and I bet the 3 questions I ask you aren't going to be the same as 6 minus 3 equals 6, right? And what about Mensa? Isn't Mensa membership indication? And taking the Mensa test, that's an indication of IQ. I mean, if you want to call it popular IQ, maybe. But if you want to talk about what real intelligence is as we understand it as science, nope, 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 nope. All right. Intelligence tests today aren't like intelligence tests used to be. You've got tests like the KBC2 by Alan Kaufman, the WISC-5 by David Wexler, although he's been dead since 1982, so really it's published in his name only. The differential ability scales, the DAS in the 2nd edition. The Stanford-Binet still around, named after Alfred Binet, named by Lewis Terman from Stanford University, all right, and it's still there. And one of the more popular ones you might never have heard of is the Woodcock-Johnson 4. The tests of cognitive ability, tests of oral language, and tests of achievement. If you want to measure your intelligence, you want to find out what your quote-unquote IQ is, these are the tests you want to take. And some of them don't even use the term IQ. The WJ4 uses the term General Intellectual Ability, GIA. Okay. The KBC uses the term Mental Processing Index or Fluid Crystallized Index. Okay. So they don't often use, the same terminology. Why? Because the terminology is outdated. We no longer use what we used to use. It is quite different. We now know what we're measuring. Here are some of those abilities that I mentioned before, and I'll apologize in advance because I wrote here, intelligence is made of these. Who am I to disagree? I travel the world in the 7 seas and everybody's looking for something, but not for IQ anymore, all right? Yeah, we know that these are the things that create intelligence. And ask yourself, do you think you're good at all of them? Do you think you really are better than 9,999 people in every single one of these? I guarantee you, even people like Einstein, okay? Anybody you might think of who could have had a high IQ, they wouldn't have been good at all of these. It's not really the way that it works. We are all good in certain things, and we're all not so good in certain things. But get this, some of us, many of us, are not bad at any of these. We're just not great at them, but we're not necessarily bad at them either. And just because you're good at some of them doesn't mean you have to be bad at others. And just because you're good at some of them doesn't mean you're going to be good at all of them. That's not the way that it works. But these are the abilities we're measuring today, not just general intelligence. And why is that important? This is why it's important. Because now we know what these abilities are and how they can affect other things in ways that we could never do it with IQ tests. Current theory and research permits identification of cognitive abilities in a very precise manner, not this general notion or general idea of intelligence. It also provides a mechanism for being able to explain why some kids have difficulties in learning to read, write, and do math, as you can see here. Okay, if you look at auditory processing, for example, that's the GA right at the bottom row there. Is it important in reading achievement? You bet, because phonetic coding is a big part of phonological processing. Is it important in writing achievement? To a certain extent, because phonological processing, phonemic awareness, being able to write the words that you want to say is going to be somewhat important, okay? But notice it's written there, but it's not in bold, which means it's not a strong correlation. It's more moderate. And what does auditory processing have to do with math achievement? Absolutely nothing, okay? What does visual processing have to do with writing achievement? Absolutely nothing. These are questions we could never answer before. These are questions that we can address now because we have better tests to be able to do it. All right. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap things up for you here because there's not much more that needs to be said. But understand that cognitive ability tests can do things today that we could never do before. The reason that we even give a test is not because we're just trying to diagnose, okay? We are actually trying to intervene. If I know what you have problems with, then I can try to do something about it. Test data that cannot be linked to intervention is basically useless. So these days, when we conduct evaluations, we're doing so because we're attempting to do something about a problem that you might have. If you are having trouble in reading, then I want to know which abilities are causing you to have trouble in reading. I literally want to know the explanations. IQ could never provide that explanation. We can look at patterns of strengths and weaknesses that you will invariably display, because these can also be used to determine how should we work with you. If I know that you have working memory difficulties, then I probably want to support your working memory when I'm trying to teach you anything. It makes sense. If I know you have trouble storing things in long-term memory, maybe I'm going to make it easier for you to access the information that you need in order to learn what you need to learn, like long division. Okay? Tests do not diagnose, people do. All of the decisions that are made on whether you are smart, whether you have a problem, whether you have a learning disability, whether you're intellectually disabled, it's not the test that does that. It's our interpretation of your performance on that test. And some people are highly qualified to be able to do that. Some people have great experience, are able to do that well, and some people don't. If someone's using the term IQ test, they probably don't know how to do this. And that's kind of a clue. Tests are really just dumb tools. They're given meaning only by practitioners with great experience and who are very astute in a clinical sense. Test results are of little value in isolation. Until we give them meaning, until an experienced clinician gives them meaning, they don't really mean much of anything. So it's well past the time that we dispense with the term IQ test. Not only does that term, okay, and that terminology unfairly characterize the nature of current tests and how good they are, all right, it prevents us also from being able to see the vast utility that comes with the advances in psychometrics as it's being guided by testable theories and by modern ideas regarding what is truly that makes us smart, that makes us intelligent. Tests today are rarely the problem, and blaming tests for providing a single useless index, such as the IQ, all right, is a hollow argument, given that modern day batteries provide vastly more information and precision than a general ability score, and they reveal stronger pathways for intervention, instruction, and remediation than ever before. So we've got to let go of it. We've got to say, IQ, it's well past its due date. We don't need it. We don't talk about it. We don't use it. We don't measure it. People that work in the field understand this, and they're much better able to provide information that is helpful. And even if we're trying to ask or answer questions that don't have anything to do with general intelligence. We don't need an IQ test, which is why we call them cognitive ability tests. If you have high cognitive ability, that's great for you. Does that mean you have high IQ? Potentially, that's what it could mean. But that doesn't tell me much about you, does it? I'd rather know, what are you good at? What are you average at? What are the things that you're poor at? That tells me far more about you than anything that your IQ could ever tell me. So I'm going to wrap up here. We're at the end. If you have any questions, they are to be directed to Dr. Julia Esparza Brown at jebrown@pdx.edu. And in closing, I'll give you a few more IQ myths here because I ran across this. I couldn't help myself. And I saw that, hey, Blaise Pascal, you may know him from Pascal, right? Somehow somebody wants to give him a 195 high IQ. Really? He died in 1662. And I've already shown you the test can't even go that high. Bobby Fischer, 187. Oh, that's really nice. I also saw somebody estimate it at 181. And notice to give you a number, 181, 187, as if the test could actually precisely measure that number. It can't, all right? And there's no evidence that Bobby Fischer ever took an IQ test. Bobby Fischer could play chess. He could really do that. Maybe he couldn't spell so well. Maybe he got lost a lot. God only knows. But 187 IQ, that's made up. Rene Descartes. Okay, Rene's been dead for several hundred years too, but you know what? Giving him a 180 and not even mentioning Newton, I think Isaac Newton would like to have a word with him, don't you? Charles Darwin, love the guy. We talked about him earlier, but 165, oh, come on, he wasn't even alive when IQ tests were invented. He was barely alive, all right? And he never took one either. We don't know what it was. And would it have been high? Who knows? He was a naturalist, not a psychologist. Mozart. Why was Mozart smart? Because he could make music? Yeah, so he might have had a 165, you want to call it that in music, but not in general intelligence, right? Einstein, here's his 161, and people put it about 160, 161. The 161 makes it look like it's really super precise, doesn't it? No, he never took an IQ test. And I'll tell you this, questions about relativity, all right, black holes, quantum physics, what else? Time travel. None of that is on an IQ test. So God only knows what his IQ truly was. And maybe in math and physics, very, very good, no doubt. But in everything else, not necessarily. Copernicus, he only gets a 160. The guy who figured out, how the planets are revolving around the Earth. Yeah, well, you know what? You can't give an IQ test to somebody that's dead. And he's been dead longer than Pascal, who died in 1662. So these, again, are just examples of how people do not understand what IQ tests truly, truly are. And I hope that this presentation has been helpful in getting you to understand how things have changed dramatically. We no longer are doing the kinds of things that we used to do. Granted, it's not like, this is all ancient history. And if you go back just to 1999 and want to criticize tests for being IQ tests, that would probably be fair. But in the last 2 decades, things have changed quite a bit. And what we talk about now in terms of intelligence is quite different than what we used to talk about when we were referring to the old IQ test. Thank you for listening.